Hello, welcome to Mutually Assured Conversation. I am here with Ute Heggen. Ute,
Yes.
what is a trans widow?
Okay. A trans widow is the ex-wife of a man or the ex-partner of a man who suddenly started this cross-dressing habit and announced that he thinks he has a trans identity. That is, he ideates that he's female.
Mm. And so I was wondering, because you've been very open about your experience, and that's kind of how I discovered your videos and you talking about other women's experience, because this is not just an isolated thing that just happened to you. I was just wondering if you could kind of walk through what your personal experience was with this kind of phenomenon that's happening.
Yes. Well, I certainly was feeling very alone in this when I discovered that my now ex-husband, who in my book has the pseudonym Nettie, I chose that because Nettie is in the long version of Little Bo Peep, and Nettie is one of her sheep. And so I have to protect my sons and myself and actually him with pen names because there will be trolls who, and this has happened to me where
Mm.
they, my sons got doxxed and things like that. This is something that happens when you are truthful and open about what's going on in the trans ideology and trans world. So I met Nettie when he was 20 and I was 18 in the mid 1970s. I had just graduated high school. We met at a folk dancing club that was at the university. This was in Madison, Wisconsin, a big university town. And we did mainly Balkan dancing, like Bulgarian line dances, Serbian dances, Hungarian couple dancing, things like that. Both of us were very interested in the folk music. It was kind of a big scene. I can't even think how to compare it to anything, except that at a certain point a while ago, there was kind of a craze for tango and samba or some kind of dance form, that's sort of like a folk form that people get together and do socially, or even here, it's called something else. I call it jitterbug, American swing dance. So it was this dance group. It actually met 3 days a week. Sometimes we had live music. And this was back in the olden days when they were, playing records, vinyl of these old recordings, scratchy old recordings of, these folk instruments and stuff from Eastern Europe, which at that time was still behind the Iron Curtain. And we were ideally suited physically to be dance partners with each other, and we had similar interests in terms of just being, very physically active with biking and camping and hiking, things like that. He seemed like a normal guy. He had a mustache when I met him. Yes, he did wear a ponytail. I would say his hair was just a little longer than mine, but that was, 1975 or 1976. And, every other guy, or now they have man buns or whatever, I didn't think, oh dear, he's effeminate or something at all. I mean, everybody was kind of like that. And he didn't seem to be smoking too much pot or dropping too much LSD, which back in the day in the 1970s in a place like Madison, Wisconsin, if you just wanted to have a kind of settled, regulated life, you had to avoid those guys who were in the drug scene because there was a big drug scene. And we got married when I was 21 and he was 23. Pretty young, but I'm from a traditional family, and I got a little bit of pressure about that when we started to live together. And I was pursuing a career in modern dance, and he was finishing up. We were both working on our undergraduate degrees. We both worked in restaurants and worked our way through university. And Continued on. He went for a graduate degree. I was trying to be a professional modern dancer. And so we went along and went along. And there was a year in Chicago and a year in New Haven and a year in New York and stuff. And then my feet gave out for being a professional dancer. So I said to him, look, we've been married for 8, 9 years or something. Let's think about having a kid, right? And so he agreed. And then I had our first son in 1988, and then our second son in 1991. And I felt that he seemed sort of stressed and distant sometimes, but a lot of changes happen in a marriage when you have a couple of children, and all of my women friends seem to be saying the same thing. And then suddenly, when we were supposed to be going to a family wedding up in Madison, and going then for a little vacation and stuff in northern Wisconsin, he came back from a 5-day business trip to San Francisco with all of the hair of his chest and arms and legs shaved off. And he had this kind of wiry red hair. And to me, that was part of the sex appeal. A lot of your pheromones are carried along on the hair on your skin and things like this. And the smell of the skin is, part of the intimacy. And I was like in shock. It was the summer. It was August of 1992. And our sons were 1 and 4. And Nettie would not answer any questions about this. His parents pretended not to notice. I could tell right away because it was summer in Chicago. We were all wearing shorts and short sleeves and so on. And he wouldn't answer. He said, "Oh, I just like this. Why are you objecting to my fashion choices?" And it suddenly sort of clicked to me. He's been going on an awful lot of business trips. What was he doing and who was he with in San Francisco? And he was really quite evasive about this. And so I thought, well, maybe he's having an affair with somebody. I can't even imagine who wants their partner's body hair to be all shaved off or whatever. And so when they were out, my husband and his mother and our little kids went out to the playground while I was finishing up the packing. I probably even kind of set that up so that I could have a few moments alone with his suitcase, which he had told me, it's full. You don't need to open it. And I just thought, okay, we have 2 little kids. We're packing all these extra clothes. We're going to a wedding. There's got to be diapers. There's, all these little extra fancy shoes, the good clothes. Don't tell me that I can't stick some things into your suitcase. So I figured something has got to be in there. And that suitcase became Pandora's box. And so after I waited, I don't know, 5 minutes to make sure they were out of the building and hadn't forgotten something, I opened the suitcase and reached in, and there they were, the 3 large format sketch notebooks, which were his cross-dressing diaries. And by the volume of them, and that there were 3 of them, and they were, 2 of them were filled from cover to cover, and one of them was almost filled. And I had to keep my shocked reaction quiet because actually my father-in-law, Nettie's father, was in his home office. He was a freelance writer. And so I just walked these things over to the dining room table and quietly sat down and paged through all 3 of them. And it was all about his adventures going out to gay bars in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, and all, dressed up sort of in drag. And of course, I asked him about that. Do you are you dressing up in drag shows or something or what? Because I knew a little bit about that. I think that the show La Cage aux Folles had already come out and stuff. And he was like very indignant now they're all sort of combined and flowing into one another, the transvestites and the drag and the transsexuals and queer and everything. But he made this very strong distinction. So I was just looking through all of these writings of his, which were quite strange for me, expressing things that I had never heard from him about, hoping to be at the center of attention of, oddly enough, he was looking for the attention of straight men who would perhaps have bad eyesight and think that he actually is a woman. And this is sort of a convention and a conceit that these guys develop, that they will pass as female.
Yeah.
But, in general, it's not going to happen. People might be impressed with, say, someone like Blair White, who wears, heavy makeup and uses filters when appearing online. But in general, when you see these guys, you can tell that they don't have the loose, shoulder joints and hip and knees that females have, and they have big hands and big feet and the larger head, usually taller. There's a certain, the shoulder to hip ratio is not at all the same between males and females. So, however, they were very tolerant of him, of course, in the gay bars. And he was especially noting, he was afraid. He was afraid of violence or something. He was noting whether, he thought this place was safe and stuff like that. But I mean, my understanding is that the gay bar scene in Manhattan in the 1990s was a pretty wild place. And I've never really experienced it. I think maybe in Madison in the 1970s. I ventured into, what was called the first gay bar there in Madison, and I saw one of my high school teachers who was surprised to see me. But anyway, so I was trying to figure out, what this means for me. Our children were little. I had been an at-home mother. I was out of, the world of work outside of doing a couple of little part-time jobs. And I thought, well, it looks like he wants to have a completely different life, and so I sort of assumed from seeing that, and it was one thing that was, hurtful to me, is that I could tell based on the volume of his writing that his cross-dressing went back into the time period when I was pregnant with our second child. And so he was leaving me when I was pregnant with a toddler, or later with an infant and a 3 or 4-year-old in the middle of Brooklyn in a working class neighborhood, while he made up a story about a meeting at work, or he was actually doing an MBA at New York University at that point. So he was making up stories about having a class or having to go to the library or something like this, and he was doing the cross-dressing expeditions. Um, and I just sat down with him and I said, okay, so I know about this. Of course, he was very indignant that I had looked into his things. And I said, listen, we just lived through the AIDS crisis in, the last decade. I saw 3 of my ballet teachers, male ballet teachers, die of AIDS. I don't know what you're doing. And I'm still nursing our 1-year-old. I'm breastfeeding. You can't just say that this is none of my business. We have children. And how much money are you spending? And because now I know, with taking, information from 66 other women, that typically these guys feel that they need to buy the most expensive brand because that's going to help them, the special shoes and the special handbag and the most expensive makeup and whatever. And they're so nice. They're so nice to these guys in those stores, right? Because their money is just as good as anyone else's money, but they know they'll probably come back. So anyway, this is all kind of like I'm filtering what I know with 2020 hindsight together with what I was experiencing right then. And I felt in a way that the life that I thought I had imagined that we were going to move to South Orange, New Jersey, a a middle class suburb, and
Mm.
maybe have another child. So my whole scheme of what my life was um, kind of just crashed before my eyes, you know. And I, you know, I didn't want anything to happen to him, but I was very concerned about the risks he was taking with his behavior because I didn't know, and I still don't know to this day what he was doing as far as intimacy, sexual adventures with men, because his attraction, he said in his diaries, was to men.
Mm.
Now, all these years later, he is actually married to a woman, so it
Mm.
didn't work out with the men. After he later went for the all the surgeries at Stanford University Medical in 1996. So uh, there was this incident that occurred when we got back to Brooklyn in September of 1992. My 1-year-old suddenly is approaching me in our kitchen with this look of, "Look, mom, what I found. I'm so smart." And he's just this little 1-year-old. He's toddling towards me, holding the large chef's knife in
Mm.
his hand. And he had pulled it out from underneath the refrigerator. Now, I had worked in restaurants. I had learned how to handle knives. There is no way that I could have swept a knife like that. The brand was Chicago Cutlery, which is, you know, it has a nice hefty wooden handle and so on. You know, it was a long blade. And I was totally freaked out. Managed to get the knife away from him and put it away in the drawer where it belonged without making him too upset. I'm kind of proud of myself about that. And he had been looking for a little Matchbox car or some toy underneath the fridge. And so then at night, after the children were asleep that night, I said to him, um, you know, our youngest found this under the refrigerator. Why is it there? And I was actually afraid that he was going to accuse me of being a bad housekeeper and that I had accidentally gotten it under the refrigerator. But I was very firm about that. You know, I reminded him about working at the first French restaurant in Madison and so on and getting training in knives. And he said, well, I had to hide that from myself. And then he went into this emotional blackmail of how the way I discovered this and how I shocked him so much and how I'm having this very bad reaction is putting him into some kind of suicidal ideation.
Yeah.
And, you know, I said, if you feel like you want to kill yourself or something, you need to call 911. Like you know, I have to take care of our children. I don't want you to kill yourself, but you know, you can't. What else are you hiding? What will I find in the closet? What will the children, you know, if they're playing hide and seek, what will they find behind the couch? What's going on? And so he, you know, he wouldn't realize that he wouldn't realize how serious I regarded this. And I learned later when I did my teacher training that this is indeed very serious, and you cannot have a suicidal adult in a household with children. Um, and so I just made plans, and a friend of mine, Allison, who said that this was the second woman that she had helped get out of a situation, helped me. I gradually put things in boxes over to her for her to send to me later at my parents'. And in October of 1992, I just took the kids and left and bought a one-way ticket at Newark Airport for cash for me and the two of us, and took myself to my parents. And I called him from the airport from a payphone. This is the kind where you stick in a quarter. This is a long time ago. And And I said, "Look, I have to leave because you say you're suicidal. I can't be here with these little kids and you're hiding knives and things. This
Mm.
can't be. And, uh, we'll figure this out later, but I have to leave." And I had already gotten advice about what I'm allowed legally to do. You can't go hide. You can't put the children somewhere where their father doesn't know where they are or something like that. I had gone to a lawyer to get some advice, and so did everything in a way that was completely legal. I told him where we were. We were at my parents'. He became very insistent about calling and talking to the kids, and it got um, it got kind of too much. He would call like 3 times a day. And then about a month later, so this would have been early November, he said that he detransitioned and that this Ruth therapist that he had written about in those diaries, that she was not qualified and she wasn't doing the right diagnosis. It was a midlife crisis. It was all these other things, and he's growing a beard, and I have to come back. And I just said, "Well, I don't know what to think," right? And then that went on for a couple of months, and then he actually coerced me and kind of threatened me, that he would sue for divorce from New York, and he said that I don't have any proof of this because I didn't rip out a page from his diary or anything, and he made this accusation that he would, say I made it all up, and he would sue me for divorce, and he would sue for custody. And these kind of threats I'm learning now from the women whose stories I'm collecting, these kind of threats are also pretty common. So I thought, well, uh, I suppose I'm obligated to try to go back, you know, and so I went back in 1993, and by the next summer, he went to a different psychologist secretly without telling me. And she wrote later in a sworn affidavit submitted to court that she diagnosed him as a transsexual in the first appointment with him on July 20th of 1993. But I didn't know that in 1993. I only knew that he was on this path of medicalization and taking the hormones and the intention to, you know, get the letters and go to a surgeon and all of this medical transitioning, so to speak. I didn't find out about that until the end of March of 1995, the day before our younger son's 4th birthday. And I realized that he was getting breast development, which meant that he was taking estrogen,
Mm.
which meant that he was doing all of these things behind my back. And he had basically violated all of the agreements, all of the things that I had required for me to go back, because I had required that that he go to a trauma specialist. I still believe that this is part of the cause, knowing now that um, it's often the case that a person who has this cross-sex ideation has experienced childhood trauma or abuse. And in fact, his father was physically abusive. I am not aware of any sexual abuse that Nettie experienced. However, he and his next younger sister, who was just 2 years younger than him, spoke about their father taking off his belt and switching them with it and so on for kind of no reason. And he was in the early years of their childhoods, he was pretty violent and unpredictable. I mean, he's deceased now, but I believe that, based on the special ed training that I subsequently had as a teacher, I believe that he had OCD and was possibly autistic because he didn't seem to read other people's social cues very well. He didn't have any friends. Um, these are all things that I can look back and just see. But so then in 1995, I got Nettie to move out, and I sent my my school records up to the New York State Department of Education and got the substitute license, and ended up putting my younger son with various friends. I had a whole little circle of friends that I would take my younger son to take care of. They were the other at-home moms, and I got myself out doing some substituting so that I could have some kind of employment record. And I got him to move out in June of 1995. And interestingly, that then in 1996, I sued for divorce, and we had to have grounds back then. New York State didn't have no-fault divorce until I think 2007. It was the last state, and I sued for divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty because he wasn't telling me the truth, which he and his attorneys found to be very shocking. So, you know, I don't, this all is very involved and everything, but it's a rather common sequence of events. Yeah. I'm curious to know, how is it that you happen to be interested in this? Are you looking to do some work in psychology, or?
No, so this is why I think that listening to your experience and listening to people you highlight is so important. Because I think, like a lot of people who are vaguely interested intellectually in these things, they get sucked up into the kind of red team versus blue team culture war stuff. And there's not much truth in that, I don't think. It's often just, like I said, red team versus blue team, right? And I think what I find so interesting about your experience and the people that you've highlighted on your channel is that you've lived through that. It's not just, like, I don't know, this conspiracy to push whatever, or these people, or they just hate this certain subgroup of people. Is there's something much more complicated going on here. And yeah, it's supposed to be really specific. Is I'm incredibly interested in what I'm working on right now, in the role that pornography and desire plays in all of this. And I think I would like to come back to that, because I think that's a super interesting topic. But I do want to just briefly touch on, again, this is kind of stepping back to how we ended up in this space where it is a culture war thing, and it's not, I don't know, it doesn't even feel like a real thing anymore. We're on the internet, it feels almost like a simulacra of people's lives almost. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I suppose coming from a philosophical angle is that I think there is something to the insights that were had with the original critical theorists. I think, say what you want about the man, but Foucault was one of the most important men in philosophy of the 20th century for sure. But where we've ended up is that we've ended up with this transgenderism movement that is essentially funded by a globally powerful government, is pushed by corporations, has complete dominance over psychology.
Yes.
As you said yourself, and this is from your own experience, is that there is a paramilitary wing that goes out and harasses people who are critical of this in any way. Mm-hmm. And again, you said it's got a complete dominance of psychology. I think every single experience that you've highlighted, these things get diagnosed in the first meeting, like in the first 20 minutes of meeting a psychologist. And that's no small thing, because that now infers legal protections. It gives people the right to medical treatments. Maybe that's not so much of an issue for an adult, but it gives people the ability to have medical treatments on their children, for example. And I'm just wondering how you think we got to this point where, this small cadre of kind of, I don't think it sounds mean, but like mentally unwell men. Because like you said, and again, this gets highlighted in a lot of the experiences that you've talked about on your channel, is that these almost always come along with comorbidities. These people are always suicidal. they often have some form of autism, and almost always it's, involves pathological lying and emotional manipulation.
Right. Well, it's very interesting for me to look back. I mean, this is a long time ago. I'm 68 now,
Right.
right? And so this is a long time ago. I met him 50 years ago, right? If I'm
Yeah.
68 and I was 18 when I met him, so I'm wondering if with the experience in the classroom teaching children with autism
Mm,
and learning more about the autism spectrum and so on, I wonder if I would have recognized him as being on the spectrum in some way.
mm,
Of course, back then, you know, what we thought of autism was the children who were stimming, shaking their hands
mm,
and not using language normally, and very very involved with special needs. However, oh yes, there's his name is Kamenetsky. There's a child psychologist in New York City now named Elliot Kamenetsky who has renamed it. He calls it, oh, what is it? Uh, obsessive compulsive disorder, uh, based on, identity-based obsessive compulsive disorder. That's what
yeah.
he's calling it. Identity-based obsessive compulsive disorder. And
Yeah.
see, I feel that, um Nettie had a terrible relationship with his father.
Yeah.
That's a pretty common thread. Like Blair White also talks about a terrible childhood abuse. Um, and many of them, um, and he couldn't relate to his father. I mean, I couldn't relate to his father. He did not communicate normally, you know, and his parents were very young when he was born. His mother was 19 and his father was 21 or 22 when he was born. This is the baby boom. He was born in the early 50s. So, I think there are a lot of things about his childhood that were, you know, stressed. They had a
Yeah.
lot of financial stress. The father didn't couldn't keep good jobs. He ended up being a freelance writer. He mostly worked for the Caterpillar tractor company.
Oh,
So and he was violent. This was I mean, I grew up back in the day when, your parents gave you a smack on the behind or something like that, but my father never took off his belt and
right.
did anything like that. I never. I might have had a smack on the hand or something like that. I mean, and I think my parents felt that, you do that because you're teaching your child that was not safe. You're next to the hot stove or something like that. This was entirely different what Nettie experienced as a child. He and his sister talked about his father getting angry at them when they were laughing in the back seat of the car
Mm,
and hauling them out of the car, taking off his belt and whipping them.
right.
That's abuse. I've been trained. I'm a retired
Yeah.
kindergarten teacher.
And it's no surprise, if you're gonna be beaten for laughing with your sister, no wonder you don't want to make any friends later on in life,
Well, uh, I mean, he actually, through the folk dance group, we did have quite a few friends,
Yeah.
and I remember meeting some friends that he had in high school. So it wasn't that he didn't have friends. His father really didn't have any friends. I mean, that was something my parents were very social. They had people over for dinner. They went out all the time. And I loved it when they went out because I would get to have a TV dinner
Mm,
with the overly salty, overly sugary things that my mother didn't cook. But they did not have a normal social life, but they were also very just barely in the lower middle class financially. Later
right.
on, his mother did the nutrition degree and worked, and then did an RN and worked, and that's really kind of what kept uh, them afloat. But how is it that, I mean, I've been, in therapy a few different times, and how is it that this um, PhD psychologist submits a sworn affidavit into our divorce proceedings declaring that in the first appointment, the first time she met him, she diagnosed him as transsexual?
Mm.
And, I know that usually it's an intake interview. You go in, you say something about the trauma that you're trying to work out in therapy, and they take some family history and some things, about your background and your health, things about your physical health history. And then they say, well, that's all for now. But next time we'll discuss, strategies for feeling better or something like that. So I'm saying, okay, so this is the sexology field that this woman, who by the way is decertified.
Mm.
She got decertified, and it might be due to a complaint I made about her. Because the certification board in New York State is in the Department of Education, and I was going through these things, to tell them on my channel and figuring out, and I hadn't looked at them in a long time. I have this 10-pound box of legal papers, and I was looking at this sworn affidavit, and I thought, this is 1993, and
Right.
even now today, general public believes that this diagnosis is carefully picked apart in the layers of the onion and unspooling it so carefully, because of course, you're supposed to decide whether it's a true trans diagnosis, and the surgeries are very involved, and so it's like, actually no, they had very little supervision, very little um, questioning even amongst themselves, although there was Paul McHugh. Do you know who he was?
No,
Paul
I don't.
Paul McHugh was one of the early sexologists,
Mm.
psychologists, and he was, I think, at an early Johns Hopkins, at the Johns Hopkins uh, gender clinic. I don't know if they called it gender clinic then. And he did a survey of patients in two groups.
Mm.
One group was post surgeries. These were mostly men.
Mm.
This goes back into like people who had been treated in the 1970s. And then those who decided against the surgeries
Right.
and just decided to live their lives without medicalization and so on. And he found that there was not evidence of greater happiness or greater life satisfaction in the
Right.
people who had done all of the surgeries, and considering all of the risks, such as incontinence, he closed down the Johns Hopkins Center. I think that was in maybe 1979 or something like that, but his MC, capital Hugh, Paul McHugh. And again, uh, because he was sort of openly Christian in his later writings, again, it got turned by the trans ideologists now into um, that he is a personality who's very, very right-wing fundamentalist Christian, and that's why he did this terrible thing and closed down the Johns Hopkins Center. And what happened is, I believe that Ray Blanchard and James Cantor and Kenneth Zucker, or at least Zucker and Blanchard, I think, had worked there, and they went up to Canada
Mm.
rather than saying, "Oh, gee, maybe this isn't such a good idea." With Paul McHugh, he's eminent in the field, and he thinks this is not such a good idea. Um, so, I mean, for me, I have always said um, he never seemed happy. Nettie, after 1996, after the surgeries, I never saw him smile, even you know, if we were we tried to do a couple of joint birthday parties and things for our kids. Um, and he was there at my older son's wedding in 2013. I mean, he just always acts really stiff, like maybe he's in pain or something. He doesn't smile. That's not the man I married, not at all.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so between 1993, when I went back, and 1995, I call my 2 years of purgatory because I really didn't know what was going on with him. Our marriage was cold, and I just focused on the children. Our children were very young, um, and this is just often the case, you know, for the phase of trans widow purgatory.
Mm.
And then something happens, and the wife realizes, okay, I have to get out of here. And for some of them, what happens is violence. Now, Nettie was not violent towards me. He sometimes threw things around, and you know, I can't say that I felt really physically threatened in the way that some of these women have been.
Yeah.
In my data of 67 trans widows, there were 4 or 5 battery strangulation cases. In
Right.
3 of them, the police were called. In 0 of them was anything prosecuted.
Yeah,
So
and this is a huge problem with the way that it is viewed through this lens, because people don't under people are imagining what the cartoonish view of a male to female transgender is. They're imagining some sort of strange, effete, nymph-like being that doesn't exist. But actually, what you forget is you've still got like a 6-foot man who is mentally unstable, and these things happen. And I think what you were saying about identity-based OCD, that's really interesting, because I know I've not heard that, but it makes a lot of sense, because
yes,
you have these, especially as you know, this thing has become more politically, legally, and culturally dominant, is you have speech codes, and that leans into some of the comorbidities, which could be, you know, childhood trauma, or it could be autism, but it gives the people some control where they
yes,
might not have had control.
exactly. And I think that's where the narcissism comes,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
because for me, it's cultivated narcissism.
Mm.
Because they're always looking in the mirror. You hear this from the detransitioners, that it was such a relief to detransition. They put the mirror out of, you know, in a different room, and they stopped, you know, worrying about, you know, where they're going to buy the next big expensive bunch of makeup, and, you know, ordering. I mean, it's quite frenetic what they get into in terms of purchasing clothing, and you know, there's a lot of profligate spending. Um, and the other pieces of this, which the mental health profession is willfully ignoring, is the drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
And many of these men, I wouldn't say that Nettie was an alcoholic, but many of the women report that their husband was an alcoholic, was an active alcoholic at the time he was diagnosed, at the time he started taking estrogen. And apparently, this was not explored at all
Right.
by the psychologist. The other piece of this that I've only just recently heard regarding young people getting sucked into this is there's a South African therapist. I don't know if I can remember his name, but he was featured on the GenSpect YouTube channel. Um, And he said, I think he's working, a lot of them have started working exclusively with detransitioners, because when you work with someone who is actively in this ideation, as a therapist, if you're sort of trying to put on the brakes and slow this down, then you can get accused of conversion therapy and lose your license and all these kind of things. But his name is like Vincent something. He said that almost 100% of them are addicted to marijuana.
Right. Uh-huh.
And it's a myth at this point in time that marijuana is real harmless and a better alternative, for self-medication than alcohol or something like that, because
Yeah.
these strains of marijuana that have been bred now over, the last 50 years, it's much higher in the THC, and it's very, very strong, and supposedly in a rather high minority of people who are regularly smoking pot now, it causes, like a mental breakdown, psychosis. There is,
Yeah.
marijuana-induced psychosis.
Yeah.
And so, it's funny, because I never smoked pot.
Yeah.
And I grew up in this university town in the 1960s and 70s. It was like there was a haze of pot smoke floating over the town. But
Yeah.
I was this dancer, and I heard all about the munchies and how then you're gonna binge and you're gonna eat too much. And so I never smoked pot. Not
Yeah.
once. I certainly learned how to drink beer over in Wisconsin, but,
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Definitely Wisconsin.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
You,
there's too much falsehood that's being promoted, and, uh, I mean, I'm always astounded by, for example, people will make these references to a man who ideates a female persona. That's how I call it. I call it cross-sex ideation. I even on my channel, I don't know if you noticed that I have a playlist which is called the Heggen Lexicon,
mm,
because if you mess your mind up with all of their terminology, which erases female existence, you
yeah.
know, then you're captured, you're brainwashed. It's George Orwell, 1984.
Yeah.
So, uh, oh gosh, now I distracted myself a little bit from the point. Oh yeah, so I made the Heggen lexicon of cross-sex ideation, and I add terms like the identity-based OCD concept from Elliot Kamenetsky. Um, and so it appears then, now see, for me, going back all those years, I really don't have any reference of Nettie using pornography.
Mm,
I, I grew up in the days of like magazines, Playboy and Hustler and stuff like that. One of my brother-in-laws I discovered when I was babysitting their children, I discovered he had a subscription. But I I was completely unaware of anything like that
mm,
in Nettie's activities. I mean, in some ways, I think that it's really too bad that Nettie decided to get all those surgeries, because um, I see him as either a bisexual or gay man.
right.
He was, sexually capable with me in the marital relationship and fathered 2 children. I got pregnant rather easily both times. But, looking back, there were little hints of gay men being attracted to him, and some things that I look back with a different lens, uh, what something meant. There was a group of gay guys in one of the restaurants where I worked who said to me, "Ute, I think your husband is gay." And, this is a long, long time ago, and I haven't kept in touch with any of them, but I honestly kinda wonder if they were telling me that because they had maybe seen him someplace.
Right.
So, and the thing is, my understanding from people who knew the scene back in the 1980s and 1990s in the gay bars, is that this was a scene where guys were walking around in various states of undress with like leather accoutrements on, and it was kind of like live pornography shows. So, but that wasn't something that he wrote about. He was writing about whether he was wearing the right color of fingernail polish and whether he was going to be able to get it all removed before he came home.
Yeah.
And things like that. But what I hear from the younger detransitioners now, and also younger women who are in the dating scene, just heterosexual women in their 20s or early 30s, is that pornography, because of the internet, because of smartphones, and because of the societal acceptance of kink,
Yeah.
the influence of pornography is very extremely evident.
Yeah.
And yeah.
This is something I've been doing a lot of research into for the last few months, and I think your experience is definitely unique because a lot of your situation happened before the internet, basically.
Yes.
And what's changed in the last few decades is that pornography has become ubiquitous, and I like really mean ubiquitous. Like, there's not really anywhere on the planet that you can't get some sort of internet connection. There are always ways around things like firewalls and that sort of stuff, and you don't need a big gray box anymore. You know, everyone's got one of
Yep.
these little terror
Yes.
screens in their pockets,
Yeah.
and what that has allowed is as unconstrained male sexuality. And I suppose this is one of the I would say one of the lies of sexual liberation movement is that, and I guess libertarianism in general, is that, you know, freedom is not really freedom. Freedom doesn't always lead to better things or happier people. Around a decade ago, the statistics were that, you know, pornography was cited as a factor in about 56% of American divorces. You now have erectile dysfunction in
Yeah.
young men, which was never a thing before.
Yeah.
Viagra is being advertised to men my age. You obviously have the collapse in birth rates. I'd be very surprised if unfettered access to pornography had nothing to do with that, considering what we know about divorce. And then you've got these extra things that are happening. Like I said, your experience happened before the internet, but it's very clear that people, you know, coming out as transgender, transsexual is going up quite a lot. And a lot of that might be driven by fashion. Like, you know, we've got things like TikTok, Instagram, whatever, and this thing is being pushed on there as well. But I think I am of the opinion that pornography, not just pornography, because pornography, eroticism's always been a thing, that sort of stuff, but this new form of pornography is like a succubus. It's a completely new thing. And I'm just wondering what you think about that, because obviously autogynephilia was coined by
Blanchard.
Blanchard, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you said yourself that you don't think it was a factor in your experience, but
I don't know.
I'm leaning towards the direction that it seems that it's a factor in the majority of them.
So, have you watched the documentary that I'm in, Behind the Looking Glass?
Yeah, it was very well put together. Yeah.
Yes. And so, there are some early little pamphlets and magazines that, kind of go by in the middle of that.
Yeah.
Um, and and so that was like the little seed, the little kernels, right? Of the cross-dressing men taking photographs of themselves and sending those in and writing about their female persona and their experience trying to do this, image of themselves. And now my husband's job starting in 1988 was um, in the tech area of an academic organization, and it's entirely possible
Yeah.
that he got himself onto, it's called, I think, 4chan or something, because wasn't that like the earliest? He could have looked for this, with whatever internet searches there would have been at his work computer. He had a pretty high position. He had a key to the building. He had a lot of autonomy.
Yeah.
So he could have been, he's trying to be his own psychiatrist, right? He's trying to figure out why he has this. I personally think that this came on to for him as our very smart 3-year-old was, you know, becoming very verbal and asking why and arguing and being stubborn. And I surmise that for my husband, that knowing that his own son, that our son is reaching the age which he was when his father started being violent with
Right.
him. And he was like kind of frozen in the face of, the terrible twos or the terrible threes or whatever, with, that his instinct might be to do what his father did, but he knows that he's not supposed to do that. And so I think some things about how much he hated his father, how much he didn't want to be male, something like that, came up, and it is kind of a trend. There's a certain subgroup who of these men who it becomes overwhelming for them when their wife is pregnant or after their wife has a child or two.
Yeah.
And so there are a whole bunch of, pieces of this that we people who don't have the PhDs in psychology, we are left to figure it out because the psychologists and the psychiatrists are not doing their jobs. Let me just tell you, though, one thing about pornography, because it did figure in the one session that I had with Ruth, who in my book, In the Curated Woods, True Tales from a Grass Widow, I named her Ruth the Charlatan. And because she didn't have any credentials, but she was working sort of under the supervision, I guess, of the PhD psychologist. And so I went to see her in probably the end of April, about a month after I discovered Nettie must have been taking estrogen for several months at least. I said, because he kept coming home then, I made him sleep out on the couch. I was like, we're done. The understanding was, if you're going into this, we already talked about this before. If you're going into this persona and you have to be female now, that's not the marriage that I entered. And we're just going to try to have an amicable divorce. And I had a hard time getting him to move out. And he later accused me in a sworn affidavit in court that I forcibly ejected him from our home, when actually I was over in Wisconsin, thousands of miles away, in June when he moved out. But I went to see Ruth because I felt that he kept coming back and saying, look, I went to these people because they keep the families together. We don't have to get a divorce. There are these other clients in that practice, and they're staying together, and lesbians are accepted. And, I'm supposed to believe that I'm a lesbian all of a sudden. And so I was like, I had this whole rehearsed, speech to make to Ruth, because I was like, okay, Ruth, you're not going to unscrew all of my joints and then put me back together in some different way. No. I
Mm.
am just very securely wired, and I know who I am, and I'm a former dancer. I at Before I had to quit dancing, I was in these wonderful ballet classes with this teacher named Cindy Green, and there were dancers from the Paul Taylor Company, from Elliott Feld. Every once in a while, we had somebody come from the New York City Ballet. I was exposed to the most beautiful female bodies. I remember some plumbers came in and they had to fix something and they were looking around. It was 10 minutes before the class was supposed to start. And they were looking around at all of these mostly women in our leotards, like, I think we died and went to heaven. you know, but I was not attracted to any of those women. So I told that little story to Ruth and I said, look, I'm here to tell you that, you know, you need to help your client now through the divorce because you're not going to talk me into this. But she launched into how, well, why wouldn't I just give it a try? Because they know a store that we can go to. And they send people to that store, and clients of hers are treated very well at that store. And you can get videos. That's the pornography. And I think she called them toys. She didn't call them sex toys, but she called them toys.
Mm.
And she implied that perhaps, you know, my sex life after all these years of marriage is getting a little bit dull. And I was like, I just feel like, lady, we have little kids. My children were 4 and 7 by that point. I was like, I just felt like, oh my God, here we are wasting all this money for her to lecture me. You could try out this door number one, or he's willing to have an open marriage with you, and you can seek, what you need from men outside. So she's introducing the professional, or the person working under the professional is suggesting some early version of polyamory.
Yeah.
and and I just said, I'm just like plain Jane, the girl next door. I don't want my children to be waking up with a fever in the middle of the night and see me and their father doing all these things. Children wake up with nightmares and with being sick, and I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
I'm not willing to do this. And so, that was that one appointment. It was mostly to let her know that you're not going to mold me like a piece of clay into something
Yeah.
you want me to be. And it's actually very damaging. I'm sure that you saw that in Behind the Looking Glass, the women who kind of tried to, put up with what his demands are with the new kind of intimacy where you're using equipment, a strap on, whatever. And
Yeah.
the thing is, in my data, um, there is a group of them where the husband got carried away during this kind of a session of probably trying to imitate sort of a sissy hypnotic porn scenario, but then he got carried away and engaged in rough sex. And so this is something that is not recognized at all, that
Yeah.
these psychologists are promoting a very unhealthy, inauthentic, superficially accommodating version of intimacy that actually is not safe for the woman. And in fact, one of the women who responded said that she really had to stop trying to do this with him because she had a scar from an emergency cesarean section, and she could feel that it was pushing on her scar.
Mm.
Women's bodies aren't meant to have a male phallus. We aren't designed that way. Our hips are made differently. Everything, you know, it's so there's really no consideration of the female in this. It's
Yeah.
only consideration of the male who
Yeah.
who has this psychiatric illness.
Yeah. And speaking in that respect, a lot of this stuff is very Faustian. And what I mean by that is it does go against just the structure of reality in so many ways. I think, you know, I don't think, I'm not going to say, again, this is like, it would be like culture war stuff for me to say, oh, all critical theory is bunk and all psychology is evil or whatever. But I think that these things are tools and they can be used for good and evil. I mean, the critiques that have come out of critical theory of society and culture have been turned around, like you said, to and the apparatus has been reconfigured away from patriarchal Western society, and now is retargeted to, like you said, erase women and
Yes.
institute this new kind of strange, weird
Unnatural.
sex positive Puritanism, I suppose
Yeah.
I would call it. I don't know what else to call it, but the reason I say Faustian is because, you know, like you said, this ties so much into technology. Like there are the things you mentioned with pornography, the specifics you mentioned, they're almost like separate entities that are having control, like psychosomatic control over men's desires and making them do
Right.
crazy things like they're possessed by a demon or something.
And just think about this, because we're adding in prescription drugs,
yeah,
often alcohol, and
yeah,
things like pot, and even possibly other drugs that I hardly know anything about, like ecstasy or, you know, whatever, party
yeah.
drugs, I guess.
Mhm.
And, um, you know, the danger for the, weaker sex is great. And I would say that it's also dangerous for men. It's
Mhm.
not good for men. I raised 2 sons, you know, I don't, first of all, um, I don't want my sons to feel that they are unworthy of whatever their accomplishments are just because they're white men. And I really am somewhat perturbed about the whole idea that they grew up with privilege, because they grew up with a lot of trauma,
Yeah.
and in a way, you know, not not feeling like they were in the middle class.
Yeah.
And, uh, I mean, at the end of that session with Ruth the charlatan, she said, "Well, you're traditional, but spunky." And I remember I felt like saying, "I'll take that. I'll
Yeah,
take it."
that's a great compliment, I think.
She meant it as an insult, of course,
Yeah,
you
I think
know.
this is something I've been thinking about for the last few years as a lapsed atheist. Is I
Oh,
realized that we go to doctors or medication, or as you've mentioned, self-medication, or even politics for what are essentially spiritual problems.
mhm.
It's not really a medical problem, you know?
Right, right. Well, I helped, this is, you know, it's very interesting. I'm a little bit curious about how you found me, but first I'll tell you about this young man, a teenager. I don't know exactly how old he was, but he found me, probably because of what I had been posting on my channel about child development,
Mm,
and that, you know, the Piaget 4 stages of development, which are universally accepted, do not go along with this concept that an infant or toddler or child can know since birth that they were born in the wrong body. It's the, you know, I don't accept it at all.
mm,
Um, and so, this kid that I call, I think I called him Paul. Yeah, I called him Paul. And so he and I emailed once a week for about 7 weeks. And he told me that he doesn't think he's trans, but he feels like his face is kind of female and his left hand. And he's just wondering what I think about this. And I just said to him, I don't believe in any trans, and I'm happy to communicate with you, but this isn't therapy, and you can ask me questions and I will just give you suggestions. and
mm.
And by the second time we communicated, I said, okay, try this. I just made it up. It's called the wellness checklist. The wellness checklist means you're going to eat healthy food. If you're eating quite a lot of sugar, you're going to cut that right down. You're not going to be doing any drinking. I assume with you, it would be underage drinking, no smoking pot. And you're going to try and get outside, and you're going to spend much less time in your room except when you're sleeping. You do your homework out at the dining room table. You don't let yourself get distracted by whatever is going on your cell phone. Start talking to your parents. It comes out that when he was 6 or 7 years old, his mother had had a traumatic miscarriage, and it was a female fetus. So he had been told at a young age that he was going to get a little sister. And then this terrible thing happened. I didn't even ask whether he was there when the miscarriage started or anything, because it could have been a really terrible trauma for him
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah.
And um and I just said, this is common among males who start thinking that they have this female side, that maybe they're meant to be more female than male or something, if there's been a death of a female relative or some close female. And there's some cases that, of course, the psychologists have not been doing their job, but there's some cases where like a sister died or something like that. So he just sort of took that in. And he was very good about not emailing me in some emergency way. Only once did he do that. And he confessed, I never asked him about sex, but he confessed he had been masturbating and that he was, all nervous about this whole thing. And he was probably watching that pornography on his phone. But I said, I want you to think about, what is your connection with nature? Is there any place that you might do some gardening? And he writes back the next week, I think I'm going to start helping my grandmother in her garden.
Beautiful.
Like,
Yeah.
well, that was easy, And
Yeah.
then by the end of this, he writes to me and says, well, sorry, I just don't have that much to say this week, because I realized I really got this idea from early exposure to pornography.
Yeah.
And that was his words. I never said pornography. I never said anything, but I had, my advice to parents who contact me is get rid of as many of the mirrors in your house as you can. Make all of the charging stations for the phones and the tablets and the computers be in the parents' bedroom, under the bed if needs be. Children need to sleep at night. They need to not be on their phone, not playing games, not watching anything. They need to, if they need to do a routine of getting to sleep, have a hard copy book to read with a little night light. Make sure they're getting enough sleep. These kids are not getting enough sleep. And, he took all of my suggestions quite seriously. I wasn't sure. It was funny. I I said to him in maybe my second reply back, I said, I have to protect myself and make sure that you're not a troll, because every once in a while I get someone who's a little bit more out there than my ex-husband, and I have to be careful about the communication. And he writes back, I'm so sorry that you think I'm a troll. I'm not a troll. I'm really a nice kid. And I'm just so confused. And he was going to an all boys school, and he said, well, I think I like girls better than boys. And I said, oh, listen, honey, teenage boys are hell. But let me tell you, teenage girls are worse than hell. I have sisters. So you don't want to be a girl, even if, you might be attracted to girls. That would be really normal. And I basically, I like this whole idea that in school, when the kids are, I don't know, 6, 8 years old, they're being lectured about what sexual orientation is.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. No. And the thing is, when you say that, then what comes back from, the left blue side of things is, oh, you must be this religious fundamentalist and you're such a Puritan and you're so repressed and stuff like that. And it's like, well, actually, there's this thing called child safeguarding, and you are telling children that there's very little difference between a child and an adult.
Yeah.
And you are luring children into inappropriate, understandings of what children do. And I know this also from being a kindergarten teacher, because when some kid got exposed to something by their older sibling, or I don't know what, some movie that their parents let them watch that they shouldn't have because it's really not for their age. Then what happens is it's what I call the virus that happens in the girls' bathroom.
Right.
Suddenly, you've got children taking their clothes off in the bathroom, and we don't do that in school. And I was actually quite good with this, like I didn't make the kids feel bad, but I was like, oh, no. We don't take a bath or a shower in school. Get your clothes back on, and then I write a little, just calm note back to the parents. And, but I mean, I remember I had this kid, what was her name? Antoinette. She's in her 20s now, but her parents were from France, and she did this little thing of coming to school with a dress on, but no panties underneath it. And she thought she was being, kind of provocative or whatever. And I went up to the mother and said, no, no. I said, underwear is our first line of defense. Children have to wear underwear. They must wear underwear, and they must have the understanding that it is inappropriate for a child or an adult in school to be touching them underneath their underwear. There's and the thing is, I did teach, for example, there was one child that we had to call the state, because he was being sexually abused. He was being awakened at night and horrible things. It was a disaster.
And I really suspect, it just comes with, there was a technological limitation many decades ago. Like, you'd need to go to your creepy uncle's house and find a VHS and whatever to have any chance at early exposure. There are incredibly, like, younger than 10 years old children who have a smartphone and have a mobile internet connection. And that, and to be honest with you, I don't know about your experience with social media and stuff. You don't really need to be looking for it to find it these days, frankly.
Oh, I know. I've had to be careful about what I look up, just for kind of the research that I want to do some background when a trans widow says, oh, I had this experience, and it's, and it's interesting because I was just yesterday, there was something about AGP, about autogynephilia, and then all of a sudden, I got all those channels, with these psychiatrically ill young men. I feel so bad for them, but I found I was really happy to see this. There's this guy named Alex Ray Williams. He's not that young. He's like in his late 30s or something, but he had a porn addiction. He was really snippy with me once when I was leaving some messages, but he had to detransition. He took estrogen for years and had pancreatitis. And then while he was in the hospital for pancreatitis, which was caused by the estrogen, he had a pulmonary embolism. And if he hadn't, which is a blood clot in your lungs, and if he hadn't been in the hospital, he probably would have died. Now, this is something that is in the warnings on the estradiol that these people are prescribing for young men. It's in the warnings. And he detransitioned, and he's also a lapsed atheist. I think he's going to actually join the Catholic Church now. But I was really glad to see that it turned out that he actually had to divorce his very liberal wife because she was an active participant in these sex play scenarios,
Hmm.
and she was politically, in this, what did she call herself, bisexual or something? She was politically in this, uh,
Right. Yeah.
sex play, uh, club, part of society, and, apparently she got really upset with him when he started wanting a connection with God, and so he got divorced last summer or something. And now he's looking so much better, you
Yeah.
know? And he admitted for the first time, this is like 2 years he had his channel, he admitted for the first time that he was also all through his transition and then even into his detransition, he was a marijuana addict, and he realized he needed to give it up. Another reason why he had a pulmonary embolism is that he had been smoking cigarettes. So this is a person who's smoking pot and cigarettes. The psychiatrist or whoever is prescribing probably testosterone blockers and estradiol to him. I mean, talk about the drugs. Plus, he's got nicotine, which increases. I mean, like, women who take birth control are not supposed to be smokers because if you're taking the birth control pills, I don't know this personally because I never smoked and I never took birth control pills, but women's risk of stroke goes way up if they're a smoker and taking birth control pills.
Right.
So this is, I feel that one thing I'm very proud of in terms of my memoir was I was focusing very much on healing because I realized that even though um, I'm so many years out of this, and I haven't seen Nettie since 2013 when our older son got married. But I realized that the outside world and the obsession with trans in the rest of the world is
Hmm.
not letting me let go of this. And then subsequently, what happened was I started agreeing to my sons with J.K. Rowling and I think this was in the summer of 1920. This little tempest in a teapot with J.K. Rowling came up where I guess it was the health service in the UK was
Hmm.
saying cervix havers and persons who menstruate and stuff
Yeah.
like that, and J.K.
Yeah.
Rowling is saying, "Oh, let's see what other word could we use instead of these ridiculous phrases."
Yeah.
"Oh, woman, it's a woman."
Yeah.
And, um, I think what happened to the left in the US in 2016 and the sort of attached the barnacle of trans on the ship of the Democrats and the left in 2016 was the Republican wins in the 2016 election.
Yeah.
And even now I've heard that as a reaction to the recent Republican wins, there's some parents who are even more upset about what their daughter is doing because their daughter is saying that she's really male and she's off at college, and their daughter just, texted them or some obnoxious thing instead of calling on the phone and said, "Well, I'm going to start taking testosterone because I'm going to prove, you know, that I can still do this and they can't take that away from me." And
Hmm.
so she's putting poison into her body as an act of political rebellion.
Yeah. Well, I thought the list that you sent to that young man was really beautiful because from personal experience, and this is, I guess, this is for anyone listening and struggling, is that your life gets better if you treat yourself like someone you care about.
Yes.
Which is so it sounds like such a non-statement, but it's true, and I think people need to relearn this in the crazy times we're in. But I think people should definitely go check out your channel. They
Oh,
should
thank
go
you.
watch the documentary Through the Looking Glass that you were featured in,
Yes,
which had
behind the looking glass.
behind the, sorry,
Yes,
beg my pardon, with has
limestone.
lots of trans widows. But I think on your channel you're up to something like 60 odd submissions of people with their experiences, right? That you're talking about.
Us, a total of 67 of us.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah,
So you're not anecdotal, that's for sure.
right.
This
I'm
is
not
a
a
thing.
dilettante.
No, definitely not.
No, as a matter of fact, I was so happy when I got into the 60s because quite a few of Ray Blanchard's studies
Yeah,
had a subject number of only, say, 59.
right. Where can people find your autobiography, which you recently published,
Oh,
right?
my memoir is published by a company called iUniverse.
Hmm.
It's so you can go iuniverse.com/bookstore and just put in Heggen, and I'm the only one.
Cool.
And it's in ebook form for something like $7, and
Right.
then you can get it almost anywhere in the world in the soft cover, which does have my gardening photos. I see gardening as very much a healing activity to do.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah. And so I'm gonna link all those in the description. And I'm just wondering, because this is a question I ask to everyone when I speak to them for the first time. I'm just wondering if you were on death row, I don't know, for maybe crimes against the state, or perhaps, I don't know. What would your last meal be if you could choose anything? What would you
Oh my
choose?
goodness. Oh. Um, Lox.
Oh yeah.
Some kind of, the way the Scandinavians on my mother's side, I'm Norwegian,
Right. Yeah.
the lox, or either lox with, like, boiled new potatoes
Oh yeah.
or, lox with a dab of sour cream and a dollop of caviar.